Making sure that if we are taking an iron supplement, we're looking at if it is a heme-based iron or if it's a non-heme iron, because a lot of fortified foods and even some supplements are going to be non-heme iron based, and therefore we could be taking something that, again, we're not necessarily absorbing and utilizing properly.
Hello and welcome to the Eat More Carbs podcast. My name is Jenna Fisher and I'm here with my co-host Reilly Beatty. Today we're going to be talking all about iron.
Before we jump in and start chatting all things iron, this is just a quick reminder that we are currently accepting new clients and new athletes who want to work with either Jenna or myself. Our Concierge Sports Nutrition Coaching Program is an individualized program for athletes who want to maximize their performance and optimize their health on an individualized basis with support and guidance from a sports dietitian.
Before we get into our iron questions, Reilly, what's your high and low?
Both my high and my low this week actually have to do with me being postpartum. Starting off with my high. Currently, I am breastfeeding Charlie. I'm actually exclusively pumping, so this is something that I didn't even know about before I became pregnant and after postpartum, but basically I'm exclusively pumping and she exclusively drinks like milk from the bottle. This was something that we decided a couple weeks after we had Charlie, just because we were having some challenges. So I have been exclusively pumping for the last 8 months, which is a whole journey in itself. But basically, I have a lot of milk stocked up in my freezer because with pumping, a lot of the times you might be an overproducer, and that was the situation that I was in. So I'm creating more milk than Charlie is drinking. What we've been doing is we have been collecting that milk and we have been freezing it. Over 8 months, I've been very lucky to stock up a lot of milk. So I currently right now have an entire freezer that is full of breast milk. Again, this might be TMI for this podcast, but we're all close friends here, so I have to share with you. So basically, I have this entire freezer full of milk with the goal of being able to stop pumping earlier, so that provides more flexibility for me. It makes it just easier for our whole family. We are currently moving to North Carolina. We are really lucky because we get relocation because of my husband's job, but I have an entire freezer of milk that cannot be unfrozen. So we had to figure out how we are going to transport this entire freezer that has about 6 months of milk stocked up in it. This has been literally stressing me out for months because every time I stash some milk and goes in the freezer, I'm like, how is this milk getting to North Carolina? Because it cannot become unfrozen. If it becomes unfrozen, you have to use it within 12 hours. And there's no way that you can use 6 months of milk within 12 hours. So I have been stressed about this freezer because what are you supposed to do with it? But this past weekend, my parents are such champs. They drove down on Saturday. We rented a U-Haul. We locked the freezer shut and they drove the freezer to North Carolina on Sunday. This entire freezer of breast milk, just for Charlie and myself. This is just a huge shout out to them. Now I get to stop pumping so much earlier. And now we have a safe location for the milk. And we were just cracking up all weekend because they think it's so funny that they're driving this truck of breast milk from South Carolina to North Carolina. And they're talking about how they were the milkmen and milk delivery and all the shenanigans. But just a huge shout out to my parents because that is such a relief for me. So that's my high. It was not necessarily expected on this podcast, but I just had to share.
Shout out to your parents. That was awesome. And I'm glad that you guys found a solution and that takes that stress off of you too.
Yeah. My low also has to do with postpartum. This is something else that nobody told me about. I smell horrible. I smell so bad because of the hormones, and I literally am giving myself the ick and nobody talks about it.
No one does talk about that.
Everybody talks about the hair loss, which is definitely happening. The amount of smells happening right now, I'm so sorry for everybody who just got the ick because I have the ick, but everybody who's listening, this is just the postpartum life right now.
But you know what? Just good things come to an end, bad things come to an end too. So it will end. That's the good part, right?
It actually has been happening since I was pregnant. And what was happening, because I was really sick in my first trimester, I could not stand the smell of me.
You couldn't stand the smell of yourself?
Yeah. And I tried 10 different deodorants and it just didn't work. Welcome, this is the TMI podcast. But hey, nobody's talking about it, so we're going to.
We're all thankful that you're sharing so that way we're better prepared for if and when those times might happen for us or other people we know.
Hopefully, if you're as shocked as I was about this, you will not be prepared. What about you? What are your high and your low?
I'm going to start off with my high. I have talked about this so many times about how fortunate and how thankful I feel to be a part of RBSN. And that was something I've probably felt from day one. This past month, my husband and I really wanted to take an extended trip that we had been really planning since we probably met one another. I had been, probably planning this since high school. But because I work at RBSN and because I'm in a private practice setting, it was something that we were able to do. Very thankful for the opportunities in private practice.
RBSN is very happy that you are a part of it.
My low kind of stems from that, I guess. But I bought a couple new outfits to go on this trip. I wanted to make sure that I didn't walk around in the exclusive athletic wear that I usually wear on a day-to-day basis. So I bought a couple cheaper, outfit pieces from Nordstrom, like things that came together as like a pair of like a skirt and a top. Anyway, I had this one outfit I really loved. I thought I looked so cute in it. I got back and I washed this like set of tank top and shorts, and I did exactly what the directions said. I hand washed it in cold water. I hung it to dry, and it is now a piece of clothing for ants. Like it is so small. It's a pair of shorts, and the shorts have shrunk so much that the lining of the inside of the shorts is longer than the short itself. Maybe this isn't the best thing for me, but I typically don't wash new clothing. I just wear them. I know other people wash them first, and that's probably what you should do, but I'm not that person. I just packed it in my suitcase, wore it, and felt great, and then came home and washed it. It is so small. Now I'm out a whole outfit that I really liked.
And you even followed the instructions. Like you took extra care. It wasn't like you just threw them in the washer dryer.
Exactly. No, I'm really good about following washing instructions because I don't want my clothes to get ruined, especially because I don't buy a lot of clothes that aren't athletic clothes. So when I do, I'm like, oh, I want to take care of this and make sure it lasts a good amount of time. But yeah, no.
Oh, I'm so sad. I feel that in my soul. Like the low is, I feel that. This is why we just have to go back to wearing athletic clothes.
Exactly. I shouldn't have deviated from what I know. Speaking of things that we know, though, we do know quite a bit about iron, and we want to share what we know about iron with you today. So we're going to chat all things iron from an athletic standpoint. The recommendations for athletes might be a little bit different from the general population or someone who's dealing with a chronic condition. So just take that as we talk through these topics. This isn't recommended advice for taking iron in a supplement or anything like that. We're just going to kind of go over the basics of what iron is and its role in the human body. So Reilly, what's iron?
Iron is one of the essential minerals that we need for a lot of different processes within the body. When we look at nutrients that we need, we have, our 6 essential nutrients. We have carbs, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. Minerals are one of those nutrients that are essential, and they do not provide any energy for the body. Iron is really important in energy production and a lot of the energy systems within our body, but it's not going to provide calories. Just going on a quick tangent before we really get into iron, but iron is a great example of why we don't always recommend calorie counting and macro counting, because iron is one of those essential nutrients and this essential mineral that might get lost when we're just focused on calories and macronutrients.
What is iron's role outside of energy production in the human body?
Iron's most known role is within the blood. Iron is really important for red blood cell production and therefore oxygen and nutrient delivery and circulation throughout the entire body. So we can think about it on a very simplified basis, is if we do not have enough iron, we cannot produce enough blood cells, and therefore we're not going to be able to deliver nutrients, specifically oxygen, to the working muscles, and this can really hinder performance in athletics, but then also just in our day-to-day.
So basically what we're saying is that when we breathe in oxygen, that oxygen latches to our red blood cells. That oxygen is then carried to our working muscles, where it's used for the production of energy within our working muscles. So it's really, really important for using our muscles, and therefore might be even more important for athletes.
Exactly. And hearing what we just talked about, you might be thinking, okay, I need lots of iron. I need to supplement with iron. And before you get into that, we have many, many things to talk about, because with iron, just like a lot of our vitamins and our minerals, supplementation is not necessarily going to give us a better performance effect, a better performance outcome. It is really important that we have enough iron, but we need to dive into it a little bit more before we just start supplementing with it.
We never want to just start supplementing something just because we hear it helps with a certain function or a certain process within our body. When it comes to iron, though, and the sources of iron, there's a lot of talk about like heme and non-heme sources. Heme iron is what we think of as our sources that come from animal products, and non-heme are going to be our sources that come from plant-based sources. So if you hear Reilly and I say heme or non-heme throughout the podcast, we're simply referring to the source of iron in which it's coming from, whether that be an animal-based product product or a plant-based product.
Correct. And with heme versus non-heme iron, it is really important to differentiate that these two iron components are not going to be equivalent in their makeup and in their bioavailability. So when we look at heme iron, which like Jenna mentioned is going to be in those animal products, heme iron is going to be much more bioavailable. Non-heme iron is not going to be as bioavailable. About 95% of our non-heme iron is actually not absorbed by the body. So we're only getting about 5% of that availability when we're consuming iron through non-heme sources.
Would it be safe to say then that heme sources of iron are an easier way or a better way potentially to get in iron?
Yes, correct. Heme iron is definitely going to, like I mentioned, be more bioavailable, and it is going to be a better source of iron for the body. But we understand that there's a lot of plant-based athletes out there or individuals who might not be really consistently consuming heme-based iron products. So, incorporating some of those non-heme iron sources is going to be just as important. The thing, though, to remember is if non-heme iron is less bioavailable, then you're going to really need to focus on that if you are a plant-based athlete. We have less iron contained in plants, and that iron is going to be in that non-heme form.
So when we're thinking about athletes, we do have a lot of athlete listeners. Why is iron so important then for athletes?
So when we look at athletes, there's going to be an elevated need for iron within the athletic population. So on a day-to-day basis, athletes will likely have an elevated need for iron based off of a couple of different things. With exercise and with performance, we do see a greater circulation. We do see a greater need for iron because of that. Additionally, you work with a lot of runners, so maybe you can talk a little bit more about this, but with exercise, we can damage red blood cells with heel strike. That's going to increase the recommended amount of iron that you need on a daily basis.
If we're thinking about the needs of an athlete being slightly more elevated than that of a non-athlete, that doesn't necessarily mean though that we need to go out and immediately start supplementing with iron, kind of like we chatted about before. But what might be some of the causes of not having enough iron in the body to see that adequately reflected in our lab values?
Oh, I'm so glad that you brought this up, and we're going to have to dive into the supplement thing because that's one of the biggest mistakes that I'm seeing athletes make. With not having enough iron deficiency, anemia, we're going to see some health outcomes, and we're also going to see some, drops in performance. We're going to start seeing more fatigue in and out of sport. Feelings of coldness is something that a lot of people feel, cold, possibly adjusted menstrual cycle because, lack of red blood cell production. I think the biggest one though that people often see is going to be that fatigue in and out of sport. Obviously too, if you get your labs checked, you're going to see, below normal values. But I think the biggest thing in the beginning is definitely going to be that fatigue. I don't know if you have any other symptoms that you see a lot in your runners.
I think as far as an iron deficiency symptoms, those are probably the biggest ones. Fatigue probably being the top, which is sometimes described as feeling tired all the time. The biggest thing that I see though is that people will assume that the feelings that they have as feeling tired, feeling low of energy is due to lack of iron or a low level of iron. So they begin to supplement without getting their labs tested. And in reality, their iron levels were okay. It was that they were under fueling. So those symptoms can often be similar to that of not adequately fueling in a runner or an athlete. And that's why it's really important not to just jump into supplementation, especially with iron, because it can be a difficult one to supplement with.
Definitely. And that's why I actually am not going to talk about any values on this episode because I don't want people trying to jump in and supplement on their own because there's just so much individuality with supplementation with iron, as well as your fueling foundation and your fueling approach with iron. And also too, labs are definitely going to be your number one place to go, but there could be so many different reasons on why your labs look the way that they look. And it can be challenging to interpret that without the help of a professional.
If we're thinking about an actual iron deficiency though, what are some things that can cause low iron?
The first thing is definitely going to be, inadequate iron intake, right? So not consuming enough iron containing products or consuming iron at the wrong time. So if you're taking it at the certain period of time after exercise, there is a hormone that is released that can block iron absorption, or there are other things like calcium, and we'll talk about some of the other products in a little bit, block iron absorption. So even if you are consuming iron, if you're not taking it at the right time, or if you're not taking it with the correct nutrients, it can definitely be blocked. On the other side of things, if you have increased iron loss, big thing I think with this is any type of surgery, which, you're going to see a blood loss or or if you have a heavy menstrual cycle, that is going to increase blood loss. Also, kind of like what we talked about with heel strike, that's going to damage red blood cells. Poor absorption, kind of going back to inadequate intake, and then increased demand, either with something like being an athlete, being pregnant, or possibly a chronic disease.
So if we look at that from what Reilly just mentioned, those individuals who might be at higher risk for developing an iron deficiency would be someone like a woman of childbearing age or someone who is pregnant who does have an increased need for iron. Also, anyone who is potentially a vegetarian or vegan and has a harder time getting those heme sources of iron in, and they're maybe more focused on their non-heme sources, but maybe don't know which non-heme sources to include or when we should be including them, kind of like Reilly mentioned. And then lastly, we have athletes and those with chronic conditions that might cause an increase for need of iron.
I was actually really anemic during most of my pregnancy, even though I was, consuming iron-based products. But something that I really struggled with was consuming like meat, steak, red meat. Those foods are going to be the highest in that heme iron. And it was really challenging for me to, even look at a piece of meat. We know that bioavailability with iron in foods is just going to be so much higher than a supplement. It was definitely a challenge that I navigated throughout pregnancy.
Very difficult, especially as an individual who has an increased need, not only from being pregnant, but also from being an athlete. There are kind of two compounding factors there when it came to maybe some of the aversions that you experienced during pregnancy. With that and getting in enough iron and what sources of iron that we can include in our diet. You mentioned red meat and kind of those meat sources, but what other like heme sources of iron are there that are easily absorbed by the body?
So steak, red meat, those are going to be your most bioavailable, and they're also going to contain the most heme containing iron compared to almost anything else. Also, lamb is another iron-rich food. Chicken, turkey, and shellfish are also going to be iron-containing products. Those are going to be your main heme iron sources.
What about non-heme iron sources?
With non-heme iron sources, those are going to be mainly found in plant-based foods. So spinach has a little bit. I really get kind of mad when people recommend spinach as an iron source because it has so little in it, and it also has like other components in there that could block iron absorption. So I'm not really sure how bioavailable the iron in spinach actually is. Another thing that is going to be really rich in non-heme iron is going to be lentils and then also hemp seeds. Those are two of the other products that I found that are going to be higher in that non-heme iron.
So incorporating some of those non-heme sources, if you are a plant-based athlete, would be a good thing to incorporate in order to add some iron or non-heme iron to your intake. As far as mitigating the risk for the development of iron deficiency, what should athletes be doing?
Something that we do at RBSN is we talk about fueling focuses a lot. And if you've been listening to Eat More Carbs podcast, or if you have worked with us one-on-one, you know that we talk about fueling focuses. And with all of our athletes, we like to have a almost like blood health fueling focus where we build a meal that is focusing on iron and iron absorption. Something that we didn't talk about with the non-heme products yet is non-heme iron, like we mentioned, is less bioavailable, but when you pair non-heme iron with vitamin C, you're going to help with that bioavailability and you're going to help with that absorption. So if we are eating lentils, we're pairing it with red bell peppers so that the vitamin C from the red bell peppers are helping you absorb that non-heme iron from the lentils. Additionally, hemp seeds are going to be rich in that non-heme iron, and we could pair that with strawberries because strawberries contain a lot of vitamin C, and that will help with the absorption of that iron from the hemp seeds. In our blood health meals, we're focusing on pairing complementary foods that are going to help with the absorption of iron, and we're also avoiding foods that are going to block the absorption of that iron. A very drastic and extreme example that I always give is don't drink a glass of milk when you eat a steak, because steak is going to contain a lot of that heme iron. Milk is going to contain a lot of calcium. Calcium and iron are going to block each other. So we're not necessarily gaining either of those nutrients in that pairing. If that's something that you love and enjoy and you think it tastes good together, go for it. But that's not necessarily going to be the fueling focus then in that meal.
So what's the difference then between food sources of iron and supplemented iron?
When you look at the research, individuals who are anemic respond so much better to a continual dosage of iron-containing food versus a supplement. And that's because we're not going to get into the super nitty-gritty, we don't want to bore anybody, but when there is a large dosage given, the bioavailability and the absorption rate by the body is going to be less. So what happens sometimes with supplementation is we're getting these huge dosings, but we're not necessarily absorbing it properly and utilizing it. So it's not going to greatly affect our iron levels, even though we've quote unquote increased our iron. So with any athlete at RBSN, what we do is we make sure that we are first adjusting the food amount and making sure that we're optimizing timing before looking at a supplement, because research supports iron from food versus from a supplement. And even if you are taking a supplement, you should look at taking it, every other day or something like that compared to taking it every day because of the absorption, and then also with compliance. So there can be a lot of like GI upset and constipation with iron supplements. So that's just something to think about and make sure that you're managing if you are somebody who is anemic
or has been prescribed an iron supplement by a medical professional, because of course we don't want to just start taking a supplement simply because we start to feel tired and we are an athlete, so we know we have increased needs, without knowing that we actually have a need for it, like Reilly mentioned in the beginning, after an analysis of lab results.
And additionally to making sure that if we are taking an iron supplement, we're looking at if it is a heme-based iron or if it's a non-heme iron, because a lot of fortified foods and even some supplements are going to be non-heme iron based, and therefore we could be taking something that, again, we're not necessarily absorbing and utilizing properly.
So if we're looking at kind of back to that whole idea of non-heme sources and fortified foods then contain non-heme sources, so it would be best to pair those fortified foods with that vitamin C again, like you mentioned before.
Yes. And something that I was actually doing a lot when I was pregnant, because I was avoiding meat products, is I was leaning on fortified foods, like something like a Quaker Oat Squares. I don't know if you've seen that cereal, but it has about 60% of your daily value of iron. And I would pair that with strawberries, and then I would use a milk product that did not contain calcium. So products like almond milk or soy milk that have not been fortified with calcium because they don't naturally contain calcium, I would use those as like the base, or like the soy would be the protein, and therefore I could not block absorption by having calcium, and then I could try to maximize the absorption by pairing that vitamin C with the non-heme iron.
So there you have it. If you are looking for a quick and easy breakfast option that is a blood health meal, Reilly just gave you a great example.
It goes back to like, it's all just so individualized, and my lab values looked different with me being pregnant versus me being non-pregnant. And even throughout my entire, 9 months of being pregnant, my lab values changed and my approach to feeling changed, because again, this is all just so individualized. Just reach out if you all have questions about anything.
Even if you are an athlete and you have lower levels of iron or potentially a lower intake of iron, working with a dietitian and making sure that you are getting in those fueling focused meals that are potentially to help boost your intake of iron is a great place to start. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Eat More Carbs podcast. If you have questions, Reilly and I, please reach out to us on Instagram. You can find Reilly at easy.sports.nutrition, and you can find me at jenna.fisher.nutrition. Please make sure you rate, subscribe, and review. And as always, remember to eat more carbs.